We're going to be in Genesis chapter 47, like I said. So if you would turn there, this is the second to last week of Genesis for us, and so 64. This is our 64th week. We did skip Genesis chapter 47 for the primary. There's a reason why this chapter is in Genesis, and it's really to set up and set forward to Exodus chapter 1. It is Jacob and his whole family, with Joseph's urging as a part of God's plan, is settling just outside of Egypt in Goshen. And the chapter is just a U-Haul truck moving them to this area. But if we want to pick up, if you would, in verse 20. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for all the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe on them. The land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made servants of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore, he did not sell their land. Verse 23, then Joseph said to the people, behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land, and at the harvest shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and as food for yourselves and your households, as food for your little ones. And they said, you have saved our lives. May it please my Lord, we will be servants to Pharaoh. So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day that Pharaoh should have the fifth. The land of the priests alone shall not become Pharaoh's. Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. And when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, if now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal kindly and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt. Let me lie with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place. He answers, I will do as you said. And he said, swear to me. And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed. And what you see here is it's God's sovereign plan as it's worked all throughout Egypt, or all throughout Genesis, they're bringing them to Egypt and settling them in this land. And from what it looks like, it's a great setup. It gives you that the real estate market's really poor at this time. Because of the famine, people gave their lands, sold their lands to Pharaoh. Pharaoh owned everything, all made in part by Joseph's interpretation of his dream, which then made Pharaoh incredibly wealthy, as Joseph planned well for the famine and is now selling it. And people are selling their homes and their land, and Pharaoh's allowing them to live on it and giving money back to Pharaoh. And so Joseph has set this up well, and now Pharaoh is reaping the benefits of what Joseph has sown. And so he gives the land to his family. To the tribes that we saw last week. We're blessed. And so it's this little picture, and I got to think they're all moving on to this land, and they're all, we really get to keep 4/5. Oh, look at all this. We were in famine, now we're being provided for. We're not in Egypt, we're just outside of it, but still a part of Egyptian land. But we're kind of a city to our own, we're a people to our own, and we're God's people, and God has set this up well. And my thought is that Joseph and his brothers, but primarily his brothers, were thinking, wow, how did we luck out so well? How did we get to this place that things were so good? All of the people that were with them, the servants and their family members, must have thought, we are being provided for so great. This is so amazing that God would do such an incredible thing. And we've all felt this from time to time in our life, where I remember when we first bought the Centralia house, there was beer cans, condoms hanging on the wall, spray paint everywhere. It's just disgusting. But when we finally stripped everything out, all the way, and gutted it, and then realized what we had bought, we were so happy. Morgan and I were so pleased. We got a 2-bedroom, 1.5 bath house and turned it into a 4-bedroom, 2-bath house. We were rolling in the dough in our minds before we even finished this thing, because this was going to be a blessing. My parents have property just near it, and as they grew old, we would know, we were reasonably sure that we would have to move down there and care for them, because that's what you do, right? You care for your elderly parents. And so we thought, God, this works perfectly into your plan. We have this house now, we can flip it and remodel it and rent it out, and then when it's time for us to move down there into our old age, once they've kicked me out of the church and I'm no longer the pastor and Preston has taken over or whatever nepotism happens, then at that point we can care for my mom and dad who, if they're both still alive, will need caring for and are way too stubborn to do anything about it, right? It's all part of the plan. I remember going down there multiple times with so many of you, especially if you were part of my youth group, just the weekends that we'd spend down together working, people putting holes in the sheetrock that we just hung. I mean, just trying to learn how to do everything. 6-foot arcs of electricity almost killing people. It was Jake getting to see me for the first time not use a guard and just use my free hand while not looking on the table saw just to freak him out, because safety, who needs it? It was just such a blessing for so long in our life, and I would think that this land was very much like that. This was given to them as a gift. In return, they're given a bunch of seed to start planting, and here we go. All we have to do is give 1/5. Most everyone was having to give 4/5. Wow, this is incredible. What a great deal. Turn to Exodus 1, if you would. You just have to scroll down a bit in your e-Bible. So here's what we know that they didn't. Exodus 1, verse 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. We just covered this, right? Each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. And here's the picture of the blessing. See, this whole generation after generation would have been the whole Joseph, his brothers, and their generation had all long since passed. And the generations that come were enjoying the blessing. We're living in the land. We're reaping what was sown in Joseph's life. And you got to think, they're fruitful and multiplied. This is going really well. I would imagine that most of them had the God of their father was being praised quite often. Okay, then it keeps going. Verse 8. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Bum, bum, bum. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread over the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Now, at that point, you would have to look up, if you are a part of God's people, and say, what has come of this? What seemed to be such a great blessing, what seemed to be a part of God's sovereign plan, because it was good. And we believe that God is good, and so he must work good to our favor. We see this repeated blessing of being fruitful and multiply. Fruitful and, you know how hard it is sometimes to get pregnant? Some of you know that very deeply. You know how hard it is to make your work life work well? If you've never been and planted on a farm, it is exceedingly difficult to grow crops and to grow. This is how I grew up. And there'd be like an early frost, and it would wipe out everything that we had grown. Luckily, we had Thriftway, so we could go and get groceries. But at this point, they've been blessed over and over again in this land and seen this. And now they're so fruitful, they've multiplied so much that they're a threat to the Egyptians. And it says kind of a foreboding way, like the Pharaoh who knew Joseph and knew how good God and his people were is dead. And now this new one is full of fear. And if you were part of God's people at this time, if you were part of Israel, and you were now being enslaved, and now bitterness, hard work, resentment of these Egyptians were coming in and enslaving us, all out of fear. You were growing and multiplying, and that wasn't even being stopped as you were being forced and oppressed and tortured. And in this, you would turn up your hands. And I know many of them, and we see this if you read all throughout Exodus, many of God's people would turn up their hands and say, God, where are you? I could see you so easily when you were blessing me. I could see you so easily when things were going well. I can know how good you are as a good dad. When the land was fruitful and it was multiplying, when our families were protected and safe, where we abound in much, everything we had, you met our needs, and now we're slaves. God, where are you? You must not be able to do anything about this, or you would, because look at all the years that you did so many good things. And you got to think, at that point in time, they must have thought their God had abandoned them. And I know many of you, it's that way for you. When affliction comes, especially in light of times of blessing, when hardship comes, when struggle comes, when something that hurts so deeply comes into your life, you get resentful about, God, where are you now? And I know what happens in your mind. I've been there. I know. You start to try to take who you would be if you were God and apply it to the sovereign God above all things. And you would say, I must have done something wrong. He must hate me. Or God must not be able to control this or stop this. He must, because he's given us these wills, we must be able to frustrate his plans. Because if not, then God would only give me good all the time. Because as I think about what a good dad is, it would be, and I was a child, I would think, giving me good all the time no matter what. And many of us get very, 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 at our least, get very hurt and offended. If not at our worst, angry and bitter in this high level of resentment about that God would do such a thing to us. We're no different often than the people in Israel at this time who must have been shaking their fist at God in the midst of this slavery. And we know how long this lasts, right? It's not a year or two. Now go back to 50. Read 50 with me. We've got to put it in that context for a reason here. Verse 1, Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for it, for that is how many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. And when the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, I am about to die in my tomb that I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan. There shall you bury me. Now therefore let me please go up and bury my father. Then I will return. And Pharaoh answered, Go up and bury your father, as he made you swear. So Joseph went to bury his father. With him he went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the household of Joseph, his brothers and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. When they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there with a great and grievous lamentation. And he made a mourning for his father 7 days. When the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, This is a grievous mourning by the Egyptians. Therefore, the place was named Abel Mizraim. It is beyond the Jordan. Thus his sons did for him as he commanded, for his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah to the east of Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. After he buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. Here's 15. This is where it gets good. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for the evil that we had done to him." You know, this is amazing. How many times has Joseph been exceedingly kind to his brothers, gracious? How many times has Joseph been so different than them? And this whole time they're thinking, he's just putting on a show for Dad. He's acting different because Dad's around. As soon as Dad's not around, then he'll exact his revenge. And we can all kind of taste this truth, yeah? Especially if you have brothers and sisters, and you know how differently you reacted around them when you were a child when Dad was around. My kids are very different when I'm around than they are with Morgan. They're a little more snippy with Morgan, and the boys tend to try to rebel and kind of strut their stuff like a little peacock. They try to rule over the house, and then Dad comes home and they're back to the way that they should be. But in this, we can see this whole time, Joseph has given them no reason to believe anything other than his goodness. And that's so important for our hearts. Because we can be very much like the brothers. When something changes in our life and something shifts, does that circumstance or person or change make us then doubt God? Joseph's been very good and very consistent in their life, and has forgiven them and reconciled with them, and has promised and made swore by God to take care of them and their children and their children's children, 3 generations. Joseph says, I have wealth beyond what you can even imagine. I'm going to handle everything. I got my first NFL contract. This is going to go well for us. We're good. I've invested properly. We're in. And now we see it again. Even though he's been this way and has been good to him and has given them grace upon grace, undeserved mercy upon undeserved mercy, they still doubt. Because now the circumstances changed to where now Joseph would be inconsistent. He's just been waiting for this opportunity. And how many of us approach God this way? When things are going well, we're like, God, you're so good. We love you. I can't believe it. Then we lose our job. Or something breaks in our house. Or a relationship is severely broken. We're sinned against greatly and something hurts. And we look, and the same God who's been consistent since the foundation of the world. Hebrews makes that very clear. Same yesterday, today, and forever. We look, and now we don't have trust. We look up, and I can't believe you would do this to me. I can't trust you. I'm hurt by you. You've been consistent, but now, since the circumstance changed, God, you must not be good any longer. So what happens? They sent a message to Joseph saying, your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgressions of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. Now please forgive the transgressions of the servants of the God of your father. They forge a letter from Paul, a deathbed letter to send, to make sure, to the clincher, the letter clincher, that would finally make Joseph really, so they could just know in their heart of hearts, finally, that we make this deal. God saying that, or Dad saying this on his deathbed, so you have to be good to us, Joseph. Please be good to us. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. He wept. He wept at what they wrote. You got to think he's reading this letter and he's saying, "What have I been anything other than who I am? Have I not demonstrated already my kindness? And now you write this letter out of fear." And I liken this to like when we make deals with God. Okay, God, this has turned sour. This has not gone the way it should have gone. I wanted it to go so much better than this. So if I do the following, then you'll do this too, right? God, please do this. You're God. I'm asking you to be you. Sort of desperate, sort of plea. We try to play some games in our mind with, well, if I don't think about that, or if it goes away, then I know God. We put a little fleece out. God, I just hope that you would be you in this case, the old you, not the you that I think you are now, because I'm mistrust. I have so much mistrust for you. And there's Joseph weeping over this. Have I been? This happens to me every so often. I try to be very gracious as a pastor, the best I possibly could be. I fail, and I understand that. And I don't want to. There's a desperate part of me that so doesn't want to. But it can be exceedingly difficult when grace upon grace has been shown to be reconciled to a person, and they would still think there's some part of me that is just waiting for that moment to finally get them back. I'm not God, so I'm not perfect. But within me, I know some things about God so well. I wouldn't want to be that way. And I got to think Joseph knows God. And he's saying, God, you've been gracious and merciful to me in the good times and the bad. So how could I be anything but different than that? And my brothers think something wrong. My brothers think, I would do this. And he wept. He says, behold, we are your servants. Verse 18, his brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, do not fear. What are you doing? For am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. He says one of the most theologically astounding and securing statements in the Bible. It's very close to Romans 8:28. He said, as for you, you meant evil against me when you sold me into slavery, but God meant that for good. God's purpose, his preordained before the foundations of the world, his sovereign, can't be interrupted, can't be thwarted purpose. You meant it for evil, he meant it for good. Why? How do we know? Well, now we know. It says, that to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Yes. He knew something that if we just knew it in our soul, we would be able to be much like Joseph in this way. We'd be able to be sold into slavery and know how to deal with it. We'd be able to be promoted at our work and know how to deal with it. We can be betrayed by those we love and know how to deal with it. We can be given an opportunity to reconcile and jump at it. Because he knew something that gave him peace in the darkness of a dungeon and gave him peace in the hands of the most powerful man in all the land at that time. He knew something about what his brothers had done. He knew something about what happened to him in prison when he was what happened to him with Potiphar and Potiphar's wife. He knew something about God, that he's sovereign, that it's his will, it's his plan. He's the one doing it, all of it. It's him. God is sovereign over evil people. God is sovereign over evil. He's sovereign over good. He's sovereign over bad. All of it. He's all-powerful. Now, please note this. You should really have some issue with this, at least a little. That's why I got a microphone this week, so you can for sure hear it and have an issue with it, yeah? Because this isn't easy for humans to take. This is a church-dividing issue. Many denominations do not believe in the sovereignty of God. Because to say certain things about God and to declare him as sovereign, fully sovereign, is what the Bible says. But it also affects our minds and hearts in ways that we can't always understand. And frankly, we take it and we morph, and that's what the brothers had done. I'm sure they had heard from their dad and they'd heard from their brother. And all these years, especially after the reconciliation, I know Joseph would have said, am I in the place of God? No. He's sovereign. It's his plan. It's his will. It's what he does. None of it thwarted. So you meant it for evil, but he's not evil. He meant it for good. It didn't take God by surprise that you sold me into slavery, brothers. It was part of his plan so that people could be saved. But if you go back into Genesis 30, Joseph wouldn't have known that at the time. He wouldn't have known how it would have worked out. When he's in the dungeon, being abandoned by people he interpreted the dreams from, do you think in his mind was, okay, at some point here, I know what's going to happen. I've had the dreams. I'm just going to go and I'm going to be second to only Pharaoh in this land because I'm going to save him from a famine. He had no idea what was going to happen, but he did know who was going to make it happen. He had an incredible peace all throughout Genesis that I want, as your pastor, so desperately for all of you. A peace that God sits on the throne, reigns and rules, and has it all under his control. All of it. All of it. God is sovereign, even over the evil things people do. It's mentioned multiple times in Genesis. And if I had the time here this morning, and I'm going to make as much time as I can, it's sovereign over the entire Bible. It's in everything, from beginning to the very end. And yet, it would be taken out of most Bibles if given the opportunity. It would be taken out of your heart if given the opportunity. Because very much like the brothers, they thought they were in control of all things. Their will extended to a certain distance, and they thought that was over God's. How many of you feel in your heart of hearts that when you're sinned against or when you sin, that it's outside of God's plan? Many of us counteract this truth and we say, okay, God waits and gives us an opportunity to either sin or be obedient. He sits patiently in heaven, kind of on his watchtower looking down, hoping that we don't sin. But when we do, then he finally goes, oh, I see what they were doing there. Flip, turn. That's how a lot of Romans 8:28, that God works all things for the good of those who love him. That's how we envision that as humans. Because when our kids mess up, or when our friends mess up, and we want to try to fix that, that's how we think. We didn't know that was coming. We didn't see that that was going to happen. They climb on top of the HD television and tip it over. Okay, they're in trouble, and now I got to fix this thing. So we think very much like that God must be in his gloriousness. He must sit in heaven and wait on us for our choice. And then once that happens, then he responds. But that's not the God of the Bible. In the story of Job, the Chaldeans raided and stole Job's camels, killing his servants who kept them. These wicked men were not acting simply on their own accord, but were impelled by Satan. And yet God was over Satan, giving him permission to go so far and no farther. Satan could not do anything unless God had willed it. I'll go on. God willed that the wicked King Ahab be killed in battle. How? How did God will it? Could have done anything, right? He's God. I've always wanted to see a little lightning. We had some cool lightning and hail last night. I was like, God, who are you trying to get? That's not how he works. Here's how he worked, though. Ready? A demon presented himself before God with the plan that he go and be a deceiving spirit in the mouth of Ahab's prophets. God granted permission. The wicked prophets prophesied falsely. Ahab believed them, so then he was killed. God's righteous judgment was carried out by a demon using deception. Huh? And yet God's not tainted by the evil. Samson wanted to marry a Philistine woman, which is clearly a sinful thing in that day. We wouldn't even know if they were a Philistine now, but his parents tried in vain to dissuade him from doing such a thing. Yet his mother and father did not, this is Judges, right from the pages of Judges. His mother and father did not know that it was of the Lord, for he was seeking an occasion against the Philistines. That Samson's marrying of this Philistine woman was part of God's plan to enact judgment on Philistines. We'll keep going. David's son Absalom sinfully committed incest with his father's concubine inside of all of Israel. Yet God declares the work to be his own. You did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all of Israel. I'm sovereign. I'm doing this. Rehoboam foolishly rejected the counsel of his elders, resulting in the division of his kingdom. But it says in 1 Kings, it was a turn of events from the Lord that he might establish his word through his prophets. That should be nuts in our minds. Nebuchadnezzar, what is this, Rakshak and Benny? It's in VeggieTale. Selfishly and brutally wiped out Jerusalem, yet he was doing God's work and is actually called 5 different times in this section God's servant. Cyrus, another pagan king, who like all pagan kings sought to build his own empire for his glory, is called God's anointed. And Isaiah 45 says, who God was using to accomplish his purpose. Look no further than Jesus. Wicked men falsely accused and crucified the Son of God, yet only did what God's hand and purpose predestined to occur before the foundation of the world. John Calvin writes, yet from these it is more than evident that they babble and talk absurdly, who, in place of God's providence, substitute bare permission, as if God sat awaiting chance events and his judgments thus depended upon human will. As if God, all-powerful, limited by us, all-powerful, limited by our will. Joseph not only knew that God was sovereign over the evil his brothers had done, he realized that God is sovereign over even the insignificant things. If you think back with me to the story, how did he get to be sold into slavery? Does anybody remember? His dad told him, go find your brothers and tattle on them. Make a report to me. Here's a jacket, wear it. This should go well for you. You're middle management now. You're going to be hated and I'm going to be loved. Oh well, get over it. Go and report, tattle, tell. So he goes, and remember when he went to find his brothers, they weren't there, right? You guys remember this? They weren't there. Then he's like, wait, Dad said they were going to be here. I have no idea where they are. And just at that time, just some random dude was walking through a field. And he was like, oh, random dude, where are my brothers? And he said, I forget the place now, Dothan. He's like, they're over in Dothan. Oh, really? Oh, okay. Random, no? He walks over, and his brothers see him coming from a distance in the coat that Daddy gave him. Oh, he's coming here to tattle on us. We should kill him. Reuben, no, don't do that. Judah, yeah, we should kill him. Okay, throw him in a pit. Let's think about how we're going to do this. They grab him, throw him in a pit. Right as Reuben's pleading, right as this Judah is pleading for how to do this, and Reuben's coming back and saying, you can't do this. What happens? Happens chance? Slavers come by. Yeah? Just a caravan of slavers. I can't tell you how this would not happen in this time. They just happen to be off their track, on their way. Not really. And they're there. And then somebody has the idea, hey, we should sell them. Joseph knew. Gets sold into Potiphar's house. Has a loose wife who's probably committed adultery a number of times and now rolls the dice on this young, attractive, strapping Gerard Butler-esque boy and says, yes, well, I should have him. And he says, no. None of it random. Do you think that Pharaoh getting upset at that point in time at baker and candlestick maker? I don't remember who the other one was. And says, cupbearer, thank you. And says, go, you're going into prison. I'm tired of you now. None of it's random. Joseph knows this. He knows God precisely at all this. I got to picture him in the back of the slavers' little caravan as he's chained up, and he, just a part of him must be thinking, well, where is God in all this? But now we see this Joseph in 50, and he doesn't believe in luck or happenstance. He believes and trusts God's sovereignty. Which we can say, oh, that's easy for him because he was blessed. There's so much hardship in his life always. Even at this point, you have brothers who you've been trying to love and care for, and they just want to constantly think of you as something that you're not. A dad who just died. A younger son who was blessed over an older son. Even in wealth, he has problems, yeah? It's important for us to affirm God's sovereignty, not just over the major things, but the little things as well. Car problems, traffic jams, interruptions, clogged drains, sick kids. Millions of things. God has it all. All within his plan. Nothing and no one can thwart God's sovereign, loving purpose towards us in Jesus. Nothing. Nothing. all things work together. That's so important. Emphasize all things. Because in our heart, we want to be betrayed by that. Oh, some things, only when we think of it as working out right. When we put God on our level and we say, well, this is how I would do it if I was God. If they did the right things, then I would do the right things back to them. And that's not God. He says, I'm going to take all things from the foundation of this world, and I'm going to display my glory in the way that I chose before everything got started, all the way from beginning to end, and I'm God. And yes, when they sin, it doesn't thwart my plan. When they sin, I make it a part of my plan. The whole context of Romans 8:28 is painful. If you read it in context, verse 17, chapter 8, verse 17 tells us that we'll be glorified with Christ if we suffer with him. That was 17. 18 says we suffer in our present time any suffering we have is not even worth comparing to the glory that's going to be revealed to us. Verse 20 says creation, including us, is subjected to futility. 21 says creation's in bondage to decay. 23 says even spirit-filled Christians groan with the fallen creation, awaiting our adoption, the redemption of our weak, sick, and dying bodies. Verse 24 says that we have been saved in hope, and you can't see hope, otherwise it wouldn't be hope. So our salvation's invisible in many ways, and yet still, in the future, we groan, we wonder. Verse 35 says and declares there'll be tribulation, distress, persecution, famine, nakedness, danger, and sword. And then in the middle of this, he says, but we know something about God. He's sovereign and all-powerful to work all these things out for the good, for your good and his glory. It says that in the midst of all this, we know. Yes, there'll be enemies. Yes, there'll be evil. Yes, things happen that we don't believe should. But all of it works together for good. Oh. Do you believe that? Can you believe that? Would you? If you hear the call of God in the gospel of Jesus Christ, if you come to God, loving him through Jesus, if you trust God for the forgiveness of your sins through the death of Jesus, if you receive from him the free gift of righteousness by faith alone, then all things, from the sweetest to the most severe and bitter and painful, will work together. All of it. And you can trust it. That's why the Bible says, if God's for us, who can be against us? That's the Bible's way of saying God is in control of all things. All of the brothers' evil, all the brothers' hate. He's in control of all that. He wills and works in that, not in response to it. That's so different. I could keep going. There's so many things in the Bible that can be brought up from this. But Genesis 45:7 says, God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep you alive for many survivors. Again, Joseph is saying, God sent me. That's such an important word. Even when the psalmist is looking back and inspired by the Holy Spirit, he summed up a famine on the land. And in Psalm 105 it says, when he summoned a famine on the land and broke all supply of bread, he sent a man ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. This word sent is important because it gives us context to that. As for what you meant for evil against me, God meant it for good. He sent me. It's God's. That's the Old Testament Romans 8:28. All things, including the evil done to Joseph and to Jacob, his father, all of those things work together. They were meant by God, sent by God. There's no better picture of this than Jesus, than the cross of Jesus Christ. What he did for us in sending Jesus to the cross to save us. In Acts 4:27 through 28, it says, in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate. Whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. So the very evil of the Jews that cried out in a bloodthirsty way, just crucify Jesus. He's not our king. Pontius Pilate, who would sit, Herod, the wicked king, Pontius Pilate, who washed his hands of the whole situation, who delivered out a murderer instead of Jesus, the Gentiles at that time. All of it, God using all of that for your salvation. God didn't just bring good out of evil and pain out of the cross. He didn't just bring it out in response to it by some miracle. It was part of his plan. So I know what you should be asking yourself, so I'll ask the question out loud. What does it add to our hope to believe this, rather than to believe that God has no purpose for particular evils that come into our lives, but only once they happen? You know what happens in our hearts and minds? We would prefer to worship a God who only responds, not uses. Responds to it. I used to believe this for so long in my life, many years as a pastor, that God gave us freedom, and in that freedom it was either to choose him or to choose evil, and he would not interfere with that choice. By the way, that's not in the Bible, but it's how I would be if I was God. I want my kids to just love me. I don't want to interfere in that choice. I can't force them to love me. So it only makes sense to give them the freedom to love me. Or not. Or choose not to love their dad, and then they don't get what they want. No, they get punished severely. That's how we think about God. It's not in the scriptures. I used to think we don't just robots if God for it. I used to believe that's why evil's here. It's an unintended consequence because God chose not to interfere with our choice to love or reject him. So evil, it was an unintended consequence of giving us will and freedom. That it was our belief that it was my belief at the time that God purposely restricted his power. How does something all-powerful restrict its power? To be weak before men and women. How? How did that make sense? How did I read the scriptures and see these very things that we talked about? That God purposed and planned and used the evil of men to accomplish his purpose. Not, oh man, that surprised me. I didn't see them want to crucify my son. I thought they would worship him. Oh, the brothers did what to Joseph? Huh? Well, I can make that good. Why this matters is, at some point in time in your life, if you believe this other way, that God chooses to be powerless in this scenario, you'll come to a crisis point. Because if you apply the powerlessness of God to some aspects of life, but not to others, what hope do you have? If he can only make evil better once it's occurred, he can't do anything about it until it's occurred. That might make sense to you, but it won't give you hope, because you'll be convinced at that point, when the evil is occurring to you, that God cannot stop it. He cannot do anything about it. He wouldn't make it good. I did a funeral, or I witnessed a teenager die every other year as a youth pastor. And my whole foundation of what I believed about God was rocked every time I saw a teenager die. Because I was like, God, why would you have her swept under a river to drown? Why would you, when a little girl is driving with her mom in a learner's permit, have her hit a median, flip her car, the car crushes her side, and mom lives and daughter dies? What do you mean you're going to make something better out of that? Why couldn't you have just stopped it then? And the whole foundation of what you would believe about God being all-powerful goes. And there goes your hope. That God would take the most horrific evil act, the sins of so many, and he would give you salvation through it. Our God is all-powerful and can do all things. And should that make you scratch your head? Yes. I give you freedom to scratch your head. Not too hard. You don't want to be bald. But it should give you the freedom to be able to say, I can't understand that fully. The Bible says that he's in control of all things and yet no way responsible for our sin. So he can control it, but not responsible for it. That's a tough one. I almost lost the mic there on that little chin shake. That's really hard to believe sometimes. I admit that. But the Bible doesn't give us other options that keep God sovereign and powerful and tell us who he really is. It is a truth that Joseph knew and accepted, and it gave him a peace. I taught this very truth once, and a mom came up to me afterward and said, I can't believe you. I won't believe you. It's not the God I worship. I said, okay, talk to me then. It's like, this is the God I worship. Okay, show me where that is in the Bible. I can't, but this is the one I think I know. Okay, how? I gave you all these verses of what God does and who God is, and that he is sovereign over all things, all the time, even the little things. And she said, okay, I'll be honest with you, I don't want to believe you. Because it means that God's sovereign over my kids. It means that whether or not my kids know him is in his hands. Whether or not they're protected is in his hands. Whether or not they rebel as teenagers is in his hands. And she said, Brian, I want it to be in my hands. And I just was heartbroken. And I said, whose hands would be better? Yours or his? You're powerless. He's powerful. You're insufficient. He is fully sufficient. He's God who reigns above all of this. And we're with him or against him. Who better to trust? I've got 3 kids. There's so often. Preston said, Dad, can I go ride my bike and invite my friends to middle school group? I was like, where? How long? Plot a point. Directions. All right, carry this GPS and the cell phone. Wear your helmet. Carry this gun. Okay, I'll follow you. I said, okay, go ahead and go. Be safe. But you're God's, not Daddy's. That doesn't mean be stupid. That doesn't mean be reckless. But it does mean when you are, God still has a plan. And it won't be thwarted by any of that. Just give us so much peace about being sinned against and sinning. That God has sent his Son to pay the penalty for that sin that he knew was coming. There was joy set before Jesus, but there was also pain as he endured the cross. It was the pain of our disobedience, the pain of our sin. Yet he willingly did that because it was part of the plan from the very beginning. You know, we read that in the little last song that Jake and the team sang. Predestined to adopt me as your son. Whatever that lyric is, I just lost all of it. It's not up there, so I'm a slave to the screen, right? Predestined. God knew you'd be here this morning. He knew you'd be hearing this. He knows what happens in your heart. He knows what sin you've committed. And knowing all of that, he sent his Son to love you in it, to forgive you of it, to redeem you through it. That's our good God, worthy to be trusted. And he's all powerful and make all things work for the good in his glory. Let's pray.